Welcome to Organizational Analysis. In this lecture, we will identify some core analytic features of organizations. These analytic features give us a language or terminology we can use to make sense of firms, their various forms, and their prevailing problems. Organizations are complex, so it helps to have a concept space, a set of things or elements to focus on in discussing them. This requires some abstraction from the details of our personal experiences in firms. For this, we rely on the work of Richard Scott. Richard Scott is a faculty member here at Stanford who's been writing about organizations for the last 3 or 4 decades. He reviewed the history of organizations research and identified a finite set of organizational elements for us to consider and focus upon. You can see these elements in the diagram in the slide. In the diagram, an organization is represented as having a boundary and being placed in a wider environment. Every organization has certain elements. It has a set of social actors or participants, a social structure by which they interrelate, a goal or mission, and a set of technologies or tasks it performs to render inputs and desired outputs. Let's take each of these elements of an organization in turn in the slides that follow. First, we have an organization's participants. These are a firm's social actors, employees, and stakeholders. Participants are social actors that make contributions to and derive benefits from the organization. For schools, these social actors are adults and children, and they typically assume roles like administrators, superintendents, or principals. Teachers can be particular adult roles. Students, staff, are others, and the staff can have roles like custodians, counselors, nurses, cafeteria workers, and even administrative assistants. Even parents and politicians connected to the school in various ways are participants. Participants can also be organizational actors, like firms in a field. If you recall, we noted that organizations are often things listed in contracts and considered to be unitary actors in some dimensions of the social life. If the technology industry, firms often have relations with one another, and they influence one another's affairs. So if we look at this particular field, the technology and information systems, we see a variety of firms whose existence is dependent on others around them and the relationships they have. Second, we have an organization's social structure. This concerns features that regulate and establish the usual pattern of relationships between participants. So social structure concerns the persistent relations existing among participants within an organization. These can vary in form, from some being vertical, others horizontal, and yet others matrix forms of organization. Simply looking at these organizational charts shows you the variety of social structures that are feasible. These can also vary in degree of formality. Formal structures entail clearly prescribed and demarcated social positions, while informal social structures emerge and are unplanned relations that persist. In a school, the formal structure might reflect the prescribed roles we briefly mentioned above: principals, assistant principal, department chair, teacher, students, counselors, so on. All of them have roles with relational obligations. The informal structure might be the actual advice relations and friendships that arise between participants. For example, some teachers may be popular in a locus of authority even though they lack such formal positioning. Likewise, for students, some may hold undue authority and influence that alters the way a curricula is taught. You can see this difference in the slide next to me here, where you see both the formal organizational chart and next to it kind of an informal network of association and advice. Social structures are more than recurring behavioral patterns. They are also cultural systems that entail normative principles and cognitive beliefs. In fact, these cultural aspects of social structure often guide behavioral patterns. For example, adults in classrooms often follow norms and ideals concerning how a teacher or manager should interact with others. That is, we have a sense of better and worse role performances, and organizations tend to reward performances that most coincide with those ideals. Social structure can even run deeper and reflect cultural cognitive beliefs and understandings. For example, we find it hard to imagine schools without teachers and students. Can you imagine one that would be created without those kinds of roles? It's very difficult to convince an environment that that's a legitimate school. Anyhow, this belief is distinct from our sense of better or worse ways to perform those roles. The belief that every school has to have these roles is deeply ingrained in societies. The belief may invoke particular behavioral norms of teaching, say traditional or progressive norms of teaching where you do, lecture versus group work. And in turn, these may partly shape the behavioral patterns witnessed in an organization like the school. So for example, eventually those kind of percolate up into the actual structure we see. But it need not do so perfectly. Other social structures are at play in organizations, like those of gender roles, class differences, peer cultures, and so on. And they can cloud the clean appearance of prescribed forms of behavioral coordination that kind of are obliged by our particular formal roles. What principles and beliefs give shape to these structures so people's behaviors adhere to them? Is it one authority and control in the formal chart? And is it one of a task adaptation from the formal organization? What is it? Or is it the informal organization? These are the kind of questions that we ask when we think about social structure in organizations. Third, organizations have goals. And these goals are desired ends that participants attempt to achieve through the performance of task activities. So for example, in schooling, the goal is, for K-12 schooling, kindergarten through 12th grade, the technical and moral socialization of youth. If we focus on faculty in universities like Stanford, we can see a historical change in what goals are present. So for example, it went from early on being one about student training to one later about research, to later one about resource acquisition and competition with other elite schools, to even today an additional layer of goals concerning social service or community service in the environment in which we live. If we look at concrete missions, they vaguely relate to some of these ends. So companies often relate general goals such as Citibank or Citigroup, Levi's, and Harley-Davidson. If we look at the slide below, we see the goal for Citi is our goal for Citigroup is to be the most respected global financial services company. Like any other public company, we're obligated to deliver profits and growth to our shareholders. And on it goes. Then we have Levi's, which says, people love our clothes and trust our company. We will market the most appealing and widely worn casual clothing in the world. We will clothe the world. That's their mission statement, somewhat of a public front and goal. And then we have Harley-Davidson. We fulfill dreams through the experience of motorcycling by providing to motorcyclists and to the general public an expanding line of motorcycles and branded products and services in select market segments. So here you have the provision of a product as a goal, and a particular kind of product. Organizations can vary in the extent to which their goals are focused or multifaceted. They can also vary the extent to which they're clear or ambiguous. So for example, if we look at my own university and we look at the two schools I work with or in, the Graduate School of Business and the School of Education, we see two very different kinds of mission statements. For the Graduate School of Business, we see a concise statement. Our mission is to create ideas that deepen and advance our understanding of management, and with those ideas to develop innovative, principled, and insightful leaders who change the world. So it's kind of a clear mission statement about building managers. If we look to the School of Education, it's a little more ambiguous or unclear and multifaceted, perhaps. Here we have aiming towards the ideal of enabling all people to achieve maximum benefit from their educational experiences. The Stanford University School of Education seeks to continue as a world leader in groundbreaking cross-disciplinary inquiries that shape educational practices, their conceptual underpinnings, and the professions that serve the enterprise. So it's one of research as well as one of practice affecting practitioners in the world. The school also seeks to develop the knowledge, wisdom, and imagination of its students. So here we have training of students as a third facet of this kind of goal. To enable them to take leadership positions in efforts to improve the quality of education around the globe. And you notice a lot of these statements talk about leaders, of going for an elite clientele and training them for the world to have greater influence and a positive one. Fourth, an organization has a technology. And this can be a confusing concept. What it means is that a technology is a means by which an organization accomplishes work or renders inputs and outputs. By this, the common word we would use is tasks. And tasks are often called technology because machines and factory lines accomplish many tasks in today's organizations. What is processed in technologies varies from material inputs of manufacturing equipment to people being processed, like in schools, or people being educated, or people being coordinated to become more knowledgeable, active citizens. So schools, for example, try to take input students and make them into output of having new skills and new sets of knowledge. The last organizational element concerns the environment, and the environment is the physical, technological, cultural, and social context in which an organization is embedded. So let's take again a school. What is the environment a school confronts? Schools are often dependent on state and city governments for resources and funds, at least in the United States. They rely on trained workers and teachers from local universities. They depend on the neighborhood they are situated in for clients and for student populations and so forth. So embedded in an environment are quite a few organizations, and they're dependent on them for a variety of concerns. Environments can vary culturally in the sense that Euro Disney initially did not work because an American version of Disneyland could not just be plopped down in Europe without some changes. Environments can vary technologically, such as having an office in Silicon Valley where everything is wired for internet access and video conferencing, in comparison to, say, my parents' home, where they're still trying to figure out how to use a CD player. Those are very different contexts for an organization to be embedded. Physical environments also matter. Consider for a second something as basic as your firm's location in a cold region versus a hot desert. They might require different kinds of infrastructure, different kinds of communication, and what have you, and travel. Very different pressures emerge because of these distinctive physical environments. So we have cultural, social, and physical kinds of environments that may actually alter the situation an organization is in. And it constitutes a distinctive element because an organization can be highly dependent on the environment for its survival. All of the internal features of an organization can come into relation with elements in the environment. Let's take each in turn. First, the participant-environment linkage. How porous is the boundary for participants in the school? Is it a total institution like a boarding school or a monastery? Or is it a loose kind of institution like a community college or a commuter campus? Second, let's consider the technology environment linkage. No organization develops its own tasks and technologies. They borrow them for the most part. So also, they have to adapt them to the norms and pressures of larger occupational structures and professions. Here we have to ask, when we consider a school and the technology environment linkage, things like, does the school get most of its curricula from textbook publishers, university faculty, or practitioners in other schools? Let's consider next goals and environment linkage. Here, the social value we attribute goals varies by environment. In some communities, the safety of students may be of greater concern than achievement. For example, in our local area here in Silicon Valley, it's a high-stress, high-achievement environment where the concerns about suicide are highly relevant. In other schools that are struggling, it might be issues of equal opportunities. So depending on the environment, the kind of goals may vary in terms of salience. Finally, we have social structure and environment. Here, we have to recognize that most organizations have similar roles, or at least schools do, but they espouse different beliefs and norms about how these roles should be performed. So, for example, in elite schools, there's a tendency to try to provide progressive models of instruction and relationships where students are listened to and more of a conversation, whereas in other contexts, you can imagine a different kind of relationship of authority. And depending on what age the students are or what have you, you can imagine different kinds of models. So we have all these elements, and they tend to have various relationships with each other and form some kind of system of interdependency in each of your cases. But these abstract elements aren't really clean. In reality, they're often very ambiguous. So, for example, schools. They're often described as having uncertain technologies for accomplishing technical and moral socialization of youth. We have courses or course labels, but it's far from clear, like course labels like algebra, but it's far from clear that particular tasks and lessons within those courses lead to certain desired outcomes, and which ones do so more effectively than others. We also have ambiguity over what kinds of indicators to use for revealing that we've accomplished those set goals. Are achievement tests or citizen tests needed? We have lots of debates as to whether they're biased or accurate, a lot of different concerns about what kinds of cognitive skills are taught or not, and on it goes. Furthermore, participants can belong to multiple organizations, so the question becomes which organization most influences the individuals or participants. Children, for example, spend most of their day in school, so it's more of a contained environment than most organizations. Nonetheless, they bring with them all sorts of baggage and experiences from elsewhere, like their family, and that can influence their behavior in school. So we have to regard organizations as not a closed-off system, but one that has all these relationships with the environment, and one which has quite a bit of ambiguity and uncertainty in it in terms of what we think will work or doesn't.